Okay, everybody, I think we will make a start for this parallel session. So, hope everybody's suitably refreshed after lunch and the poster session. For those who don't know me, my name is Chris Brown from Queen's University Belfast. Delighted to be chairing this session this afternoon. So I'm going to provide a very quick overview of our speakers, and then I'll introduce them one by one. We have approximately 20 minutes per speaker, and that includes the presentation and some time for Q&A. So do be thinking about your questions and engaging with the speakers as much as possible, but I will try to keep us at a time because we have 4 excellent speakers and we want to give them as much time as possible. So I guess as a brief overview to the sort of the purpose and the focus of this particular session is around measuring research culture progress, and I suppose that is one of the biggest questions facing us all, whether we're within a university, a funder, policymaker, or we're an individual researcher or staff member in an institution. How do we measure progress in something as broad, complex, and relational as research culture? And I think, as we all know, unlike publications and grant income and some of the traditional metrics, culture does resist simple metrics. It lives more in the behaviours, relationships, shared values, and our institutional and departmental practices within our universities and research performing organisations. And increasingly we are being asked to demonstrate the progress that is being made, and there was a very sort of lively discussion on that this morning, not only for our own internal institutional learning and development, but in some cases for more sort of formal research assessment. And at Queen's we've been grappling with this ourselves, particularly how we track progress against research culture without distorting the behaviours that we want to encourage. It's easy to measure the things that are visible, and that was discussed this morning, but much harder to capture things like trust, inclusion, and a sense of belonging. And one of the things that struck me this morning is that we looked at a couple of reports that were published way back, 2020-21 when this whole thing started, particularly the Wellcome Trust report on reporting on the sort of findings of the survey about what researchers think about the culture that they operate within. And one of the things I sort of was thinking about during that was, well, really interesting to survey those people again now and see if the same findings came back. We've done loads of work around research culture, but what does that actually meant for the people on the ground experiencing some of these challenges? And not applicable to everybody in the room, but for UK institutions in particular, this sort of question looms quite large in the context of REF 2029 and the introduction of this sort of enhanced people, culture and environment element of that. And there are mixed views in the sector, obviously, on how we do that. I think it's an important thing, it's an important development. Others maybe are concerned about, an extra layer of assessment and bureaucracy and so on. We're going to hear a bit more from Yolana about that shortly. So today's session, we've got 4 outstanding speakers. Very brief overview of who you're going to be hearing from. So first of all, we're going to hear from Dr Yolana Pringle, who will reflect on the UK's approach to developing responsible and meaningful research culture indicators for REF 2029. Then Professor Geraldine Fitzpatrick will challenge us to think about how we centre emotional and relational aspects of culture in what we choose to measure. Dr James Morris will then talk to us about how Science Europe, which was referenced earlier this morning, is working to track research culture progress on an international scale, so I'm sure there'll be a lot of interest around that. And finally, Professor Candy Rowe will offer a UK institutional case study outlining how Newcastle University are evaluating progress and experimenting with different approaches on the ground. I guess an important thing just before I hand over to the first speaker, this session isn't just about solutions, it's also a space for sort of questioning assumptions, sharing lessons, and I think most importantly, acknowledging where we don't yet have the answers. And I'd encourage you to think critically, challenge the speakers where needed, and contribute to the discussion through the Q&A. So a brief introduction to our first speaker, who, as I said, is Dr Yolana Pringle, who is Deputy CEO and Director of Programmes and Partnerships at CRAC-Vitae. Yolana has been leading sector work on research culture and the REF 2029 PCE elements. So those of you from UK universities will probably be very familiar with Yolana from various sort of events and presentations. She brings deep expertise in researcher development and sits on multiple sort of advisory boards around that. And today she's going to share some reflections on how research culture can be assessed responsibly based on the co-development of indicators for the next REF. So without further ado, I will hand over to Yolana.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you very much, Chris, and it's a real pleasure to be here this afternoon. So over the last year, I have been involved in a project to co-develop indicators to be used in the assessment of REF PCE. This project has been going on over the last year, and it's involved consultation with over 500 people from across the higher education sector and beyond through a series of iterative workshops. And we've worked together to think about what's valued, what's important when it comes to research culture. We've thought about the quality and the availability of data within higher education institutions. The answer to that one is that there's very little that's being collected consistently across the UK higher education sector. And we've thought about how this can be measured and assessed in a responsible and meaningful way in the context of an exercise that is responsible for allocating a huge, really significant pot of funding across the UK. So I would just like to talk through the project and some of the insights from the workshops that we heard from the sector workshops on the indicators development. And I thought that I would approach this from the perspective of responsible research assessment, in part because, as I'm sure most of the people here in the room are very much aware, REF is responsible for around £2 billion of research funding annually across the UK higher education sector. And so that's a really, really high stakes exercise. And so the prize for institutions that do well in this is really high. And that means that there is a real potential for these indicators to drive negative behaviours in the sector. We also know, and we're already starting to see already in the sector, that REF is a strong driver of behaviours. That's one of the reasons why the joint funding bodies in the UK, and particularly Research England, have been very keen to expand what's assessed through the REF exercise to include research culture, because they see it as an important way of recognising how important it is, how important and central culture is to academic excellence, to research excellence in different settings. And so also the stakes of getting this wrong, the implications, particularly for researchers, if by expanding the remit of REF to include research culture ends up driving more negative behaviours and negative practices in the sector, again, those consequences could be really significant and long-lasting. So I'm aware that not everyone in the room is probably quite as deeply embedded in this piece of policy development as some of those who are here from UK higher education institutions. So just very briefly, the REF, the Research Excellence Framework, is changing for 2029. And what was formerly known as the environment element is being expanded to incorporate research culture. This is an evolution, not a revolution. So research culture has been assessed in previous iterations of REF. It was there in 2021. It was there in the criteria. And also different aspects of research culture have also been assessed through different elements of REF in previous iterations as well. What is different is that research culture is really being centred in this exercise. And there is a really clear and very important message that is being promoted and advocated for through this, that research culture is critical to research excellence. That you cannot have research excellence unless you are supporting everyone who's involved in the research process. You cannot have that unless you're valuing them and you're enabling them to succeed and to survive. To survive, in many contexts it is to survive, but also to thrive in whatever role they have that's connected to research and innovation. So this has been a very long process. So back in June 2023, the joint funding bodies published the initial decisions and launched a consultation on these proposed changes to REF. That consultation covered a broad range of areas related to REF, and then research culture, and these proposed changes to PCE was one part of that. And since then, the joint funding bodies have engaged in numerous different consultation exercises, of which the Indicators project that I've been part of is just one. And this process of policy development is still ongoing. So at the moment, Research England are running a pilot exercise with 40 institutions in the UK to test the indicators that were developed through the project that I was involved in, and to use that as the basis to work out what the final guidance is going to be. So that process will then happen in the autumn, with the expected final guidance only available next year. And so, as I was putting together this timeline, it kind of made me think. It made me think kind of about that question of, are we able to assess research culture responsibly through the REF in two different ways? And the first one is just the timescale that it has taken. That this is a really, really lengthy piece of policy development. And I think from a responsible research assessment perspective, that's great. That means you can consult widely, you can go through multiple iterative stages, and you can test that it resonates with the sector in terms of their values, but also, and that's the purpose of the pilot now, you can see what's feasible, and you can build in that time for reflection and to really scrutinise what any unintended consequences may be. Of course, the downside of that is that institutions, the UK institutions who are participating in REF, are desperate for the guidance. They're desperate, they're almost for the answers. And something that certainly we heard through a lot of the sector workshops that we ran on the indicators, that while the sector wants to be consulted and they want to be involved in this, at the same time, they also want the answers because they know that they're going to have to prepare for this exercise that is worth a significant amount of money. At the same time, the scale of the consultation, while again fantastic from a responsible research assessment perspective, it's also meant that there have been so many different voices and different perspectives that have had to be heard and taken into account in this process. And reconciling all of those different ideas has been incredibly challenging. And I think even when the final guidance is produced next year, it's not going to please everyone, because there's no way that it could. It's not going to be able to incorporate absolutely everything that people feel are important. But one of the things that I am hoping through this process is that even if there are those aspects of research culture that the sector has decided are important, but we're not able to assess in REF 2029, that we will look ahead to future iterations of the exercise and start to think about what kinds of data needs to be collected. So the REF PCE Indicators project started in January 2024, and this was a partnership between Technopolis UK and Vitae in collaboration with a range of sector partners who represented different aspects of the research system as well as different aspects of research culture. So these included those who have expertise and professional experience in research management, as well as staff networks and other aspects of research culture. And the overarching aims were to develop a set of indicators that could be used by institutions to evidence what they submit as part of REF PCE, to produce the draft submission templates for PCE, and to put forward recommendations on their use to the joint funding bodies. And it's this last point that I think was really, really important. And through all of those sector workshops, we captured a really huge volume of different perspectives as to how practically an exercise like this might be implicated. And they've all been put together in a report that should be available later this year. The approach that we took through the project was to follow the scope process for developing the indicators. And that scope process really emphasises starting with what you value. And that's one of the reasons why we held so many different sector workshops and spent quite a lot of time thinking about what it is that we value as a sector before we started to think about, okay, well, what data is available. Because one of the things that Scope emphasises is that by starting with what you value, you don't just start with what's easy to capture and what's easy to collect, but you actually start with what's important to you before you then do all of that questioning around how is this going to be implemented and what's feasible. So one of the things that we did at the start of the project was that we conducted a thematic analysis to better understand what those areas of alignment are within the sector in relation to research culture. So we looked at the various frameworks that are available, including the Science Europe framework, other sector definitions, the Royal Society definition in particular was one that we found was embedded across the UK higher education sector and beyond. We looked at the 155 submissions that came in as part of the consultation on REF PCE as part of that initial decisions process. And we also looked at a sample of 40 institutional strategies and statements in relation to research culture. So we were very interested in trying to understand how institutions themselves were prioritising different aspects of research culture and what they saw as the priority issues within their own contexts. And one of the things that was really clear very early on from that was the diversity of points at which institutions are at their journey in relation to research culture. That there are some institutions, particularly larger English higher education institutions, that had very well-developed strategies, many of them co-developed with their researcher communities and professional communities. And then there were others who had much more kind of basic approaches to research culture and hadn't really had perhaps the time or the resource to really engage in those research culture agendas. And so we took this to the workshops, used it to inform the areas which we'd identified, and these came across quite consistently as well as being important across all these different institutions, but also as an important reminder that those institutions were at very, very different points in their journey in relation to research culture. So we found a huge diversity of things that come under that research culture umbrella across the sector, but there were some areas where there was quite clear alignment. And these were in relation to equality, diversity and inclusion, openness and open research, recognition, so recognition for all those who are involved in research and research endeavours, research integrity and reproducibility, and collaboration. And these themes really held up through all of the sector workshops that we were at. And what was interesting, though, is that while these areas retained their importance through the consultation that we engaged in as part of the project, there were a couple of other issues that came through time and time again. And particularly I'm referring to mental health and well-being. And this wasn't something that came up very prominently in the institutional consultation on REF PCE. We very rarely found it as part of research culture strategies and statements on individual institutional websites. It's there in sector frameworks, which is not to say it's not there, but it was nowhere near as prominent as these other areas. But in the sector workshops, where we had representatives from researchers and staff networks, mental health and well-being came up again and again as something that should have much, much greater prominence. So that was quite interesting. And the other one was time. And time is this cross-cutting issue. And And by that, kind of mean the time not just to engage in research, for researchers to have the time and to have that freedom to be creative, to explore new ideas and to publish and engage in other types of outputs. But also for those involved, for example, in EDI initiatives or research integrity initiatives or any other initiative or program of activity that is geared towards improving the research culture, that they have the time to do that, and that is recognised within workloads and promotion and progression criteria as well. So there are a couple of things that came through really strongly in the sector workshops, many of which are also real tensions, and were real tensions throughout the project, and I think still haven't quite been resolved through this process of policy development. The first being that it was very clear early on that there was little appetite for a narrow REF definition for research culture, and actually some concern that this would be counterproductive to some of the efforts to improve research culture in the sector, and that it might limit creativity in this area. Research culture is an area that is ever evolving, and I think the conversations that we'll be having on research culture in 5 years' time will probably be very different to the ones that we're having now. And this sense that REF is such a driver of what is valued in the sector that if it were to have a narrow definition, that would be limiting and it would be stifling. And it might also work against some of that diversity that we see in the sector as well. Now, that was a tension throughout the project because while it was very clear from the workshops that there was a sense that the approach to research culture should be kept broad, we also had to balance that against institutions that needed clarity and they needed guidance, and that ultimately if they're going to be asked to write submissions describing the research culture in their institution, they need to know what it is they should be writing about and what it is they should be focusing on. And so that was part of the puzzle that we really grappled with through this project, and it's one that I know Research England continues to think about very carefully through the pilot exercise. One of the things that we asked early doors in the workshops was what should be the purpose for assessing research culture in REF, and we had a wide range of responses to this question, but there were two that came up again and again, and the first one being to really incentivise institutions to take research culture seriously, that actually, one real positive outcome of this expansion is that research culture is being talked about at the highest levels of universities. Not always in a positive way, but it is on the agenda, and actually that in itself is a huge leap forwards. And then the second one being that it should be to reward progress within institutions, and in line with kind of responsible research assessment principles as well, this should be a reflective process, and it should be through a journey-travelled approach. So taking into account the very different starting points that institutions are at in relation to research culture. And then a real sense that the narrative will be really, really important in assessing research culture, that the use of any metrics, particularly quantitative metrics, that always need to be contextualised, and that there is a need to think really broadly about the kinds of indicators that we can use, that there are enough indicators in the list to allow institutions that look really different to each other to select what's most appropriate to them and the journey that they want to tell, the story that they want to tell about the research cultures that they're creating. And that the indicators should reward the relevance of what institutions are doing, that they should reward how effective they are and how well they can be evidenced, and that they shouldn't just reward the institutions with the most amount of money. So Finally, just a couple of additional reflections on some of the tensions that came out through this process, which I think have remain tensions in this and remain, I think, foremost concerns when we're thinking about whether it is possible to do this in a responsible manner. There will be unintended consequences. There is with any change and anything that is this big in scope. But whether we can anticipate those and whether we can look to mitigate them, I think that these are things that we should be bearing in mind. And so the first is, well, it became very clear very early on that there's very limited and inconsistent data that's being collected across institutions. So there's a real risk that institutional statements will, in some cases, feel like they're not robust, they're not rigorous, and they're not backed up by evidence. And I think that would be a real shame as well, in terms of making the case that we can and we should be assessing research culture in an exercise like this. There were lots of challenges and lots of contentious opinions, in particular, around the use of survey data. And that was a real tension, in part because, as we all know, research culture is ultimately, it's about behaviours and individuals' subjective experiences. And how do you get to that? And how do you get to that, particularly without relying on survey data? There was one suggestion in a workshop that we propose a mystery shopper approach to REF, which I thought was quite a good one. I don't think that's going to happen, but that was a tension that, again, I think has not fully been resolved. There's that challenge between narrative burden versus meaningful reflection. There was really, really strong messages throughout all of the workshops that I was in about how important it is that we encourage institutions to be honest. A good, positive, open research culture is one that is reflective and that learns from failure, that recognises failure. But how to do that in an exercise that is ultimately about rewarding excellence is very difficult, and I think perhaps requires a broader conversation about what exactly excellence is, so that ability to recognise and learn from failure is seen as a core part of excellence. Lots and lots of tensions between the standardisation that has to come from a REF template and that institutional nuance and diversity, and how to do that without overburdening institutions as well. And then finally, that risk, which I still think remains a risk and one that needs to continue to be thought through, is that the indicators themselves become tick box exercises. And we're already hearing from some institutions who are looking to develop their research culture strategies that they're looking at the pilot guidance and they're thinking, okay, I can draw from that. And I think there's some real dangers if we go down that route. That's all from me. Thank you very much.
Talk a little about what a narrative burden might feel like.
One of the initial reasons for developing indicators was to streamline the process, to make it easier for institutions to complete their submissions. The original intention was that there would be a narrow list of compulsory indicators that institutions would report on. And as the workshops unfolded, it became very clear that most of the indicators that institutions are currently able to support on require contextualization. They require a narrative around them to explain, okay, why have you decided to put in place this initiative? How have you evaluated it? What data do you have in response? And that in itself is quite burdensome because it's not just a question of collecting the data, it's also thinking about what's the story and how can I shape it as well. And so the process, as it evolved, shifted towards thinking about okay, how do we create a structured narrative and then have a longer list of optional indicators that institutions can pick from to evidence what they're trying to say. But that in itself creates additional burden because you're having to assess what you have, what you don't have, what's best going to help you tell your story, what is your story. There's a lot in there.
Okay, so our second speaker is Professor Geraldine Fitzpatrick, who's a leader in human-computer interaction, academic development, formerly based at the Vienna University of Technology, if I got that right. So Geraldine brings unique perspective to these discussions that blend computer science, coaching, psychology, and clinical practice. And her talk's going to challenge us to think beyond output-based measures, exploring how relational and emotional aspects of research culture can and should be captured, reminding us that people are at the heart of the matter. So over to you, Geraldine.
So thanks, Chris. I'm trying to get my timer sorted out. Thank you. So as Chris said, I come from an informatics background, professor, but human-centred technology was the passion that drove me. And in the later part of my career, I've really been driven by a concern for human-centred academia because I was hearing again and again and again from people about the pressures and stresses that people were under, reflecting the mental health and well-being, for example, issues that come up and the time pressures. And so towards that, I started a podcast in 2016 called Changing Academic Life. And I then went and did a master's degree in applied positive psychology and coaching psychology. And so I'm going to be speaking very much from those sort of biases and perspectives and repeating a lot of what's been said already. And I'm driven particularly about like the real stories. You know, we talk about institutions, we talk about collaboration and all these labels, but I have a professor that I know of who runs this research group, and by many of the indicators that I've seen talked about in ways of measuring research culture, he would have a great story to tell. But I also teach. I've also had many of his PhD students and his postdocs in some of the courses and workshops that I run. And the stories I hear present a really toxic workplace culture. So they're achieving the research excellence indicators, but at what cost and to whom? And that's the people at the heart of research culture that I really care about. And we know that this isn't an isolated incident. There was just a paper in Nature last week about problems in the German context. And it reflects what a lovely quote from Tom Welton in the Royal Society booklet on culture about culture isn't set by policy statements. It's through people with whom we interact with in thousands of seemingly insignificant interactions. And that's, for me, the core of research culture and where we really need to affect change. And I don't think it's one or the other. I think it's both. We need both of the higher level indicators, but this is where the hardest stuff is, as people have said. And we see these sorts of issues reflected as well in anyone who's talked about, there are lots of initiatives about research culture awards, and here are two examples where they've done an analysis of research culture award nominations. And again, what you see there are the repeated themes about people skills, core people skills, about how well people are listened to, how they're valued. And I know a lot of this language is included in our diversity and inclusion and belonging literature, but this is reflecting the lived experience on the ground. So the question that I'm sort of trying to ask is, and this is really still work in progress, doing the talk has been a great opportunity to sort of reflect on this. So these are half-baked ideas. But how can we complement some of those easy capture measures outputs, how do we capture and promote good people practices? And this is where I really struggle with the language of measure, because I have a qualitative research bent.
Yes.
We talk about measuring, but we're not talking about how do we promote these practices. And we know that what we measure skews behaviours, that's a fact. But these aren't just behaviours like I have got to upload my data set to an open data source repository. These are really tough human skills, interactional skills, interpersonal skills, and they need training and practice. It's a behaviour change problem. And so, yes, we can measure progress towards getting there, but it needs to be complemented by ways in which we can promote those practices. And reflecting some of what was said this morning about looking outside the sector, I want to just offer a couple of my half-baked sort of thoughts, drawing from some research on culture generally and drawing on research from positive psychology, positive organisational psychology, because that positive organisational, I'll get to that in a tick. So, because I think they might just invite some different ways of thinking about this. So, one of the things that we often see in the many varied definitions of research culture is around, values, norms, artefacts, behaviours. And there's research by Barsad and various others who talk about this as cognitive culture. And when we think about what we heard this morning, we could think about this as setting up sort of like that infrastructure. There's also work that they've done that complements that notion of cognitive culture with emotional culture. And there's Mandy O'Neill is very much continuing that work, and there's a lot of research in that area about how you might measure it. I don't particularly agree with it, but there's work that we can draw on. And then there's a whole lot of other people who are doing research that we could talk about in terms of relational culture. And so I think it could be useful to think about a me, we, us level, and that reflects the levels that were talked about this morning as well. And us can be more of that sort of institutional, sort of infrastructural level, right down to the very local personal level. From the positive psychology, positive organisational psychology lens, again, I'm going to reuse the me, we, us distinctions, but with slightly different interpretations. But we can see at the us level, it's about how do we create sort of, I guess, the policies and so on that try to promote safe and healthy environments, right to how do we interact together? What does collegiality actually look like? How do we develop people? How do we create psychologically safe environments for people? How do we educate our leaders to express care and compassion and understand their role in creating the culture? And how do we experience that culture, and how do we engage as individuals in looking after well-being and contributing to the sort of emotional landscape of the workplace? So we could just take as an example like the infographic, the Royal Society infographic and the key themes, or we could pick up any of the key themes that we talk about in terms of research culture. And you could imagine unpacking those columns in details and then thinking about what might what might be contributions to good research culture at the me, we and us level for each of those points. And how might we think about then measuring or evaluating those? And you could also imagine using a sort of a structure like this where you might, because everyone's at different stages, identify what might be priorities to work on as foundations and what next and so on. So that's one offering, is just thinking about the me, we, us levels, because they all interplay. And often I think the us level gets a lot of the emphasis because they're the easier outputs to measure. But we're actually engaging with really complex systems, as has been said a number of times. And you know, how do we grapple with the empowering the who at the me level, encouraging people-centred practices and really good leadership practices and really good interpersonal skills at the we level, as you know, and how do we create the good environments for the what's? So it's balancing that sort of excellence-centred as well as people-centred. And it is an and challenge. I was talking at the break about some work that's done that talks about middle out, where you can think of the us as setting up the top down, setting the policies and structures, and the bottom up being the lived expression of those, or interpretation and delivery of the culture within a context. And again, if we look outside the sector, there are many different initiatives and evaluation approaches that we could draw on for thinking about this. So, you know, in the health and policy sector, realist evaluation has been used for a long time. And I love the tagline for it, which is about what works for whom under what circumstances. Because we've already heard a lot today about the ways in which our organisations and contexts are very different and are at different stages in different sectors and so on. And so that can be something that we could draw on to unpack when something works, why does it work and why not. We could also look at some of the behaviour change literature. That professor that I talked about in the beginning has been on compulsory training for diversity and inclusion. But going on training or even increasing awareness does not translate into actual change in behaviour. So how do we sort of incentivise that or encourage that or monitor that? And I could point to some other work that's being done in the business sector that's really evolving sort of a model of trying to follow behaviour change, following training. And then there's also ways in which we can draw on existing theories and models that capture what does it take to create great workplaces and to create great work relationships. And towards this, and I am Australian, but I'm not trying to promote Australia. I haven't lived there for a long time. But I think I present this just as an example that could provide some food for thought. And this is triggered by Australia's workplace health and safety laws that identify what they call psychosocial hazards in the workplace. It's framed as hazards. But we can see the way in which these are reflecting, you know, if you think of the opposite, what are the sort of behaviours that we want to encourage. And what's interesting about this code is it puts the duty of responsibility not at this sort of amorphous organisational level, but at the line managers and the supervisors and even colleagues in the workplace. And it's not so much the code that I want to point to, but these reports that were done for the Australian Human Resource Institute. And what I love about these reports is that they've taken the research and the models and theories from positive psychology, positive organisational psychology, and reinterpreted them in terms of how to move from not just sort of a prevention and a compliance mindset in monitoring, but in a promotion mindset. And I'd recommend the reports to look at. So I'm not going to go through the reports because they're too complicated, but just to point to some of the particular theories that they connect to in their surveys. So I like the fact that they capture quite diverse aspects from the sort of health and well-being and what makes for the good relationships to self-determination theory around autonomy and competence and so on, to job demands resources models that are often tied up with burnout research, to psychological safety. And they then evaluate these in their surveys at the me, we and us level. And they've got lots of examples of how they do this across time, how they compare the different levels, how they compare the role of different types of leader support. It's just a really rich report driven by good science about what makes for great workplaces. That's an ongoing driver, and these have been done at scale. So that's sort of a second offering, is just to point to some different models that could suggest, from outside of the sector, that could suggest different ways of engaging. So that's it. I just really care about the people side of it. As an academic, or a recent academic, I am also concerned about academics being increasingly burdened with tick box exercises that don't result in real change, that don't result in great workplaces. That's the core foundation of research excellence, not just putting your data into an open repository. And if we can get the people things right with the enabling infrastructures at the us level, then I think we've got a chance of real change. But that's hard work. That's hard work. So thank you.
Thank you, Geraldine. That was really good. And I was just wondering, have you any thoughts on the potential contributions of behavioural economics, not just organisational change in this? I mean, I know it's been a little bit discredited of late with Dan Early and Gina, whatever her name is, but nonetheless, they are also trying to get at the core of why people behave the way they do.
Yeah. I don't have any expertise or in-depth knowledge in that area to comment, other than to say, I think as a sector we could take advantage of work that has been done to ask that question. It could be interesting to have a workshop bringing together people from some of these areas to say, what are you doing and what could we apply to this sector as, in improving research culture? Because sometimes it feels like we're trying to reinvent the wheel, and many of us come from a science background. Yeah.
We've got time for one more question, if there are any others before we move on. So one more here from Karen. Do you want to bring the microphone over? Just wait for the microphone's behind there. Thanks.
Sorry. Yeah, I think I totally agree with you. I think the people-centered element is really important, but I think it's also very challenging to reach the levels you talk about. And one reflection I've had very often is that to realize that some behaviors weren't acceptable, that took me actually to leave academia and see different sectoral contexts where things worked very differently.
Yeah.
And it's only then that I sometimes realized these things aren't normal. But most of my colleagues had never been anywhere else.
Yeah.
They have grown into jobs their entire career in this kind of single ecosystem, so they might never come to the realization. So do you have any reflections on that as a part of that challenge?
Yeah, it is a real challenge because our role models haven't been good in the past. And the cultures that we're reproducing, and then combined with the external pressures for performance metrics and so on. And I think it's really about increasing the offerings from institutions around training. And I know that I'm doing that work, and I'm not trying to promote my own work, but I just think it's so important. People who've come to some of our courses say that it's made a real difference in how they understand and think about people and their role and so on, because they've never been taught that. As academics, we're taught how to do research, how to write research proposals, how to publish results, how to play the game, but we're not taught those core human skills. So I think we do need to complement research assessment, research culture measures with with culture promotion measures that actually train people. And then there's the challenge about how do you get the right people to come to the courses, because again, you know, that professor that I'm talking about there in particular, he will never come to a course that's needed. And I've been having this discussion with the HR people at my old university where I do some work for them. And you know, it's an ongoing challenge. So I think the generational question this morning points to that there will be a change over time, because I'm seeing much more openness in younger generations and researchers who won't tolerate a lot of what people of my generation tolerated. So I think the generation change, and I think hopefully we can expedite that a bit through taking this training seriously, and not just as a tick box exercise, I've been to the course, but how do we then encourage ongoing reflective practice about how am I going being a better listener, how am I going, you know, whatever skill I'm trying to develop.
Thank you.
Thank you very much again, Geraldine. Okay, so our third speaker is Dr. James Morris, who's Senior Policy Officer at Science Europe, where he leads work on research, culture and assessment. So James is going to give us a European perspective, teed up this morning, so high expectations. And he's going to talk us about how they're building a framework for research culture across multiple nations. So over to yourself, James.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I think I'm going to talk about a lot of the themes that have already been raised by the other speakers, but hopefully from a slightly different level of organization. So I work at Science Europe. For those that don't know, we're an association based in Brussels, an association of research funding and performing organizations from across Europe. We have 40 member organizations spread across 30 European countries, including the likes of Health Research Board, Research Ireland and UKRI, and their equivalent national funding agencies from most European countries. So we deal with all kinds of research policies. Currently we have 3 strategic priorities. Firstly, in red, part of our core work is about shaping European research policy developments, so looking into things like what will the next EU framework programme look like as a follow-on to Horizon Europe, questions like international cooperation, research security, the funding of major research infrastructures. We have a priority on science for tackling societal challenges that looks at concepts around greening research, science communication, and trust in science. And in the middle, we have a priority on contributing to the evolution of research culture, and that's the work that I deal with within Science Europe. I think importantly, in the wording of that priority, and that was something that was, I think, raised by Ben in the first session, we took a long time to formulate what we meant when we wanted to focus on research culture. We know that funding agencies particularly can be really important drivers of research cultures, but when we're thinking about who owns research cultures, we didn't think that it was the funding agencies that should be taking ownership, but rather should be listening to their respective research communities and the needs of those communities, and then how that is implemented through policy and practice. And that was why we term it contributing to the evolution of research cultures. So we've already seen this figure. I think it's a really nice infographic from the Royal Society that demonstrates, on one hand, the complexity of what research cultures can be, but I think most importantly for me, how different policy priorities, how different aspects of our research systems can be and should be connected together to create a system where research ideas and researchers can flourish. And that was really an inspiration for us when we decided that research culture should be one of our focuses at a European level. So what do we mean as Science Europe by research cultures. This is something that took us quite a while to understand ourselves. We somewhat naively named research culture as one of our strategic priorities without really knowing what we meant by it. We took a lot of the work done in the UK and in Ireland as inspiration, but many of our members, many of the member states that our organizations represent had not used the term research culture before and didn't really know